Good morning, everyone. I'm Howard Fillit. I'm the founding executive director and chief science officer for the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation. I'm so sorry I can't be with you there today personally, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you through this video. I've been in Alzheimer's research and care for over 40 years, and my message to you today is that I've never been more optimistic about what we're doing. There have been many recent trials testing amyloid drugs to remove the amyloid from the brain of patients with Alzheimer's disease. The most recent one actually was a very well-designed and interesting study that I want to tell you about because we learned so much from it that it really presents a template for going forward in future trials and illustrates why we're doing much better trials than we have ever in the past. And this is an important advance in our field. The Biogen study was a great success for a couple of reasons. One is that for the first time we really had 100% of people enrolled in the trial actually had a positive amyloid PET scan, which is a technology our foundation helped to develop at Penn. And this meant that for the first time really 100% of people that went into the trial actually had amyloid in their brain and had Alzheimer's disease. And prior to that, we were just really dependent on clinical diagnosis, which is wrong a lot of times. The study showed that the drug actually worked. The anti-amyloid monoclonal antibody removed amyloid from the brain of patients with Alzheimer's, which was what it was intended to do. So we had the first rigorous test, really, of the amyloid hypothesis. And unfortunately, although we haven't seen the data yet, and the phase 1b was encouraging, Biogen obviously stopped the clinical phase 3 trial because of lack of efficacy. So it was a rigorous, well-designed clinical trial that tested the amyloid hypothesis in a very beneficial way and seemed to show that this hypothesis may not be the way to go to develop effective therapeutics. Which brings me to what I think is a growing interest in alternate mechanisms to address in terms of developing drugs for Alzheimer's disease. We've had a portfolio for over almost 20 years now, addressing things like autophagy and proteostasis, vascular involvement in Alzheimer's disease, inflammation, which is a hallmark of aging, epigenetics, neuronal energy failure and insulin resistance in the brain, in the aging brain, and finally epigenetics and neuroprotection. So these are 6 global categories of therapeutics that really are derived from the biology of aging. And it's certainly clear that for the vast majority of people with Alzheimer's disease, more than 95%, aging is the leading risk factor. And so we believe that, like other diseases of aging and old age, that Alzheimer's disease will require attacks on multiple pathways that lead to neurodegeneration and ultimately combination therapy. There's also a lot of exciting things going on with repurposing right now. One of the only phase 3 clinical trials that's going on right now is employing a low dose of a drug currently on the market called levetiracetam to reduce neuronal hyperactivity in the aging hippocampus in people with mild cognitive impairment, and maybe one of the first repurposing drugs that may come to market for Alzheimer's disease, much as thalidomide helped to create a fabulously successful biotech company called Celgene. The other major advance in our field has been recently, in the last 5 years or so, really tremendous gains in our understanding and development of biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. The amyloid PET scan that I mentioned earlier was the first FDA-approved diagnostic for Alzheimer's disease. It's changed the way we do early diagnosis. As a practicing clinician, I can order this test at the local radiology office and tell people within 24 hours and about 98% certainty whether or not they have Alzheimer's disease in the brain. And that's really revolutionized not only clinical trials, as I mentioned earlier, but also clinical practice and also prevention. Because this biomarker can detect people 20, 30 years before they become symptomatic who are having Alzheimer's disease in their brain, and has already resulted in prevention trials for Alzheimer's disease that are ongoing today around the world, not to mention the multi-domain, multi-interventional clinical trials for prevention that incorporate lifestyle and comorbidity management for Alzheimer's disease. But we do need new and novel biomarkers to attack these novel mechanisms that I mentioned earlier, like inflammation, for example. Inflammation is a hallmark of aging, and what we're starting to see now is that we can measure inflammatory markers in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease using novel PET scans. We can measure novel biomarkers in the CSF with showing that there are inflammatory molecules in the CSF, in the spinal fluid of people with Alzheimer's disease. And we're finally seeing these inflammatory markers in the blood of people with Alzheimer's disease. And there are many clinical trials going on right now of anti-inflammatory drugs for Alzheimer's disease, drugs that target not only systemic inflammation that comes from aging and old age diseases, but also neuroinflammation. Companies that are developing drugs to inhibit the microglia from producing these inflammatory cytokines that are cytotoxic to neurons. And so I think within 3 to 4 years, we're going to have a blood test for Alzheimer's disease. Our foundation is doing this in a partnership with Bill Gates and Jeff and Mackenzie Bezos and other well-known philanthropists through an effort that we're running called the Diagnostics Accelerator. And the Diagnostics Accelerator, the purpose of it is to really commercialize the blood test and perhaps a retinal test through ophthalmological examination. And we're also pursuing digital biomarkers, measuring using watches and other kinds of devices to measure the function and cognition of people on your iPhone, for example. And this is also going to change not only clinical care, but the way that we do Alzheimer clinical trials, because by using measures that can do on-time monitoring on a constant basis, we can get many more data points in clinical trials that will make them more reliable. So there's just so much going on right now that I'm so optimistic about our progress that we've made over the last 35 years or so, beginning from a time when we really knew nothing about Alzheimer's disease to a time now where we know tremendous amount about the biology and the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease. And there are just so many, in my view, therapeutic opportunities. And the one problem that we still face, however, is financing. And particularly financing for biotech companies that are interested in this space and have interesting programs in this space and are ripe for investment. They may be risky. We've had a lot of failures. Investors are wary. And that's why our foundation, the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, is investing in biotechnology companies. We've made well over 110 investments in these companies. And the idea of InvestToCure to help accelerate investment in these companies through their model. So let me conclude by saying that I hope you all have a terrific conference today. As someone who's been in the field for over 40 years, I'm very excited about what's going on today in our field. And we're going to conquer Alzheimer's disease. We're going to have a blood test. And I think we'll have novel therapeutics soon. And I hope you have a terrific conference. Thank you very much for listening.